Letter of James, chapter 2, verses 14 through 26. Genuine faith. Genuine Christian faith is active, productive, and visible. Jesus said, "We will be known by the fruit we produce." The Apostle Paul said that faith works through love, and that we have been created in Christ Jesus to do good works, which God prepared in advance for us to do. But nowhere is the necessity of faith in action more clearly spelled out than in our passage today in the letter of James. Faith without works is dead, verse 26, is probably the most famous statement in all of James. James gives us 4 illustrations, and at the end of each, he summarizes in one sentence what each illustration is teaching. The poor fellow believer in need, the demons who believe and are afraid, Abraham, the friend of God, and Rahab, who protected Joshua's spies. The poor fellow believer. In first century Palestine, the incidence of poverty was extremely high, and it is very likely that many in James's churches were dirt poor. What do the folks who are better off say to the brother or sister experiencing hard times? James gives us the hypothetical answer in verse 16. In the New Living Translation, it reads, "Goodbye and have a good day. Stay warm and eat well." This sounds well-meaning and politically correct, but what's missing here is going to their own wardrobe and pantry and getting out their own clothing and food and sharing it with their unfortunate brother or sister. The essential generosity is missing. Goodbye and have a good day. Well, there's nothing wrong with those words, but in this case, they are a religious cover for failure to act. There's a crucial disconnect between the words and the action. The Apostle John said, "If anyone has material possessions and sees a brother or sister in need, but has no pity on them, how can the love of God be in that person?" Dear children, let us not love with words or speech, but with actions and in truth. The Bible does not tell us a lot about demons, and it's not likely they look like this picture, but what we do know about them is they obviously oppose God, know the reality of His holiness, and fear His punishment. They know there is one true God, but that does not save them from their ultimate fate in hell. They know the truth, but they don't submit to God. We could say they believe, but that doesn't make them believers. Abraham is held up as the prime example of faithfulness in both the Old Testament and the New. We first see his encounter with God when he was living in Haran, Mesopotamia. God told him to leave his homeland and unconditionally promised to give him a new land and make him into a great nation that would bless the world. Abraham believed God, and he was considered righteous because he put his faith in God. But the depth of his faith is seen many years later when he is willing to obey God and sacrifice his son Isaac. James says that Abraham's faith and actions were working together. Working together, what does that mean? Well, for one, his faith clearly caused him to do what he did. But even more than this, works somehow completes our faith. In other words, not only did Abraham's faith spur on his action did something to his faith. Abraham's willingness to sacrifice his son richly filled his earlier profession of faith with fuller meaning. Abraham's action was the culmination of his life of obedience, giving it significance. And God's declaration of Abraham's righteousness, given years before Isaac was even born, was reconfirmed. There is an interplay between faith and works that goes both directions. We might think that it was easy for Abraham to trust God because he was materially well off. But look at Rahab. She was by comparison poor, a prostitute with no social status. She lived in the wall that surrounded the city of Jericho. When Joshua first entered the promised land, He sent spies into the city. Their presence was detected, but Rahab hid them and helped them escape by lowering them down the city wall by a rope. Her motivation was clear. She recognized the authority of the one true God of Israel and chose to put her faith in him. As a reward, she and her family survived the Israelite invasion. Notice how each of the four illustrations is summarized and explained by an ending statement. Verse 17, faith by itself, if it is not accompanied by action, is dead. Verse 20, faith without deeds is useless. Verse 24, a person is considered righteous by what they do and not by faith alone. Verse 26, faith without deeds is dead. Obviously, in all four instances, James is making one overall statement. How we actually behave reveals what we actually believe. Our actions reveal the genuineness of our faith. Our outward conduct reflects our inward convictions. Without the external correlates of faith, the internal presence of faith is to be questioned. Unexpressed, invisible faith is purely imaginary, and mere profession of faith proves nothing as to its reality. There is danger in taking isolated statements from the writings of James and Paul and setting them in opposition to each other. For example, here's James. You see that a person is considered righteous by what they do and not by faith alone. And here's Paul. For we maintain that a person is justified by faith apart from the works of the law. Taken by themselves, these statements seem to say opposite things. Which is true? Both are. Here are some things that may help us sort out the differences between James and Paul. Nowhere does James say we are saved by our works. What he actually says, as we saw earlier, is that faith and actions work together. And nowhere does Paul say we can have faith without it showing in our actions. On the contrary, he says that faith leads to obedience and good works. 8 out of the 11 times James says faith, he is using it in a negative sense, as a claim of belief that is devoid of evidence of true faith. That so-called faith cannot save. When Paul says faith, he is talking about genuine trust in the Lord that is indeed the basis for our salvation. Paul is talking about how true faith is established in our lives, while James is describing how true faith verifies its presence in our lives. Faith saves, works proves it. When James says works, he means the works of love that should be seen in all believers. This is the same as the fruit of the Spirit: love, joy, peace, forbearance, kindness, goodness, faithfulness, gentleness, and self-control. It is the natural spiritual outgrowth of one's faith. When Paul says works, he is talking about the requirements of Jewish law, that is, circumcision, food restrictions, and observance of special days. When we contrast James' faith with Paul's, we're often comparing apples to oranges. Paul is addressing Christians who are tempted to think doing works saves them, while James is writing to Christians who are tempted not to do works. The message to one group is by necessity very different from the message to the other. Both James and Paul assume that faith is inherent in works, and vice versa. Paul pointedly calls it faith working through love. He would say works alone will not enable you to be saved, while James would say works are entirely necessary once you are. Remember that all along, James has been warning us about trials and temptations. Well, now he is giving us one huge temptation: the tendency to substitute head knowledge for genuine faith. It results in nominal or minimal Christianity. One of the greatest challenges to the modern Christian church is nominalism. Even large and superficially vibrant churches have pews filled with persons aptly described as hearers of the word, but not doers. Christians sometimes think they can go to the right church, hold the right doctrine, and say the right things, but fail to live in obedience to God and His Word. But head faith is dead faith if it makes little difference in how we conduct our lives. We are not justified through or on the basis of our works, but neither are we justified without them. Without works, faith is not really faith, certainly not saving faith. It's been said, faith alone saves, but faith that saves is never alone, but is accompanied by living deeds. This is the way. Ongoing and growing faith showing itself in ongoing and increasing works. As the slogan goes, faith is the root and deeds are the fruit. What is the antidote to nominal Christianity? Obedience from the heart. We obey God because He is loving and trustworthy. We obey God because obedience is the overflow of a heart filled with gratitude. We obey God because we want to. This is what genuine faith looks and feels like. In Mere Christianity, C.S. Lewis said, "To trust Him means, of course, trying to do all that He says. If you have really handed yourself over to Him, it must follow that you are trying to obey Him, but trying in a new way, a less worried way. Not doing things in order to be saved, but because He has begun to save you already. Not hoping to get to heaven as a reward for your actions, but inevitably wanting to act in a certain way because a first faint gleam of heaven is already inside you." The gleam of heaven is already inside you. And since the Christian faith is an inside-out thing, the only authentic faith, James says, is faith in action.